right, well, I'd really like to welcome Tim today. Tim's an environmental engineer from Monash University. His main research focus is on studying long-term catchment hydrology and its resilience to change, especially things like droughts. So I kind of stumbled across Tim's work a year or two ago from his science paper. So, you know, I've been bumbling around Southeast Australia chasing fish since the mid-1980s. And you kind of observe a lot of things over that time. But of course, you know, you see creeks that used to catch fish in and now there's no water in them today. And I can wave my arms around and say, you know, this is a really important issue and rah, 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 but it doesn't mean anything because I haven't actually studied it. It's just a few random observations. But Tim's basically dedicated his academic career to actually figuring out this stuff, which is really of exceptional importance to any aquatic ecosystems in southeastern Australia and probably beyond. And in many respects, I suspect the problems in Victoria are actually a little bit behind the problems in New South Wales and probably parts of Queensland as well. I think it's a bit exacerbated up there. But yeah, Tim's the first stuff I've really seen that actually kind of tries to quantify these issues and try and understand them. But you know, even just documenting the fact that so many of these catchments aren't recovering after these droughts is a really important issue for so many things. So with that, I'll pass it on to Tim. And
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks for asking me to present today. It's interesting you say you've seen these sort of your anecdotal feelings of aquatic ecosystems not being like they used to be. And since this paper's come out, I've had quite a few people in the US and Western Europe and parts of Victoria contact me and say similar things. I think there is quite a bit more to this story in the ecological space, but you know, being a hydrologist and never strong in biology, this presentation is looking at the water side of the story, and I'll try to sort of speculate about some possible ecological things with a few figures, some of the results. So we're going to be talking about catchments may not recover from drought. I'll be starting off with some empirical evidence for this, and then stepping back to some of the underlying theory that we've developed for quite a few years that led up to being able to look empirically for the results. Okay. So, as Peter mentioned, this is all what I'm going to be talking about is a paper that I published in Science, research paper in Science at the sort of middle of last year. And it's titled Watersheds May Not Recover from Drought. Myself and colleagues at Melbourne Uni, Margarita Saft and Murray Peel, and a previous master's research student I had, Andrew Johns. So you may have seen this, but also what was very nice is Science commissioned a broader study by Flavia Tora on what it means for hydrology and water supply, and so you know, sort of examined further by her, but then also ABC News, you know, Science News in the US, phys.org, and a couple of hundred other news outlets around the world. So they presented that sort of overarching digestible story, but I want to dig a little bit deeper in today about what I mean by catchments not recovering. Do we know if they're really going to recover, and what might be causing this? So first off, before we get into observations, what's the current state of knowledge about catchments recovering or not? I'm being a little bit cheeky here and sort of showing the two extremes, but I think it's valuable. So Anna van Loon did a very nice summary some years ago where she tried to capture sort of how catchments respond and recover from disturbances. So transient disturbances, and she was focusing on droughts. So to illustrate, I'll just see if I can change my pointer. So she said, okay, we've got some meteorological drought that comes along, period of low rainfall. We might have some measure of streamflow in the solid black, and unsurprisingly, less rain, less streamflow. Groundwater in the dashed also declines, but it might be a little bit lagged. It could be lagged before, could be lagged afterwards. But then when the meteorological drought ends, the stream flow and groundwater eventually recover. So she's really assumed the catchments always recover. It's just a matter of time. I've always been skeptical that our world is this sort of linear and stable. And so there's a bit of theoretical work, opposing opinion that says, well, okay, maybe the world's a bit different. So maybe we've got some system state, could be streamflow, and it's bouncing around some sort of steady state. And then we have a drought that comes along in the year 16 to 21. And unsurprisingly, again, this streamflow declines. But then when we return to average rainfall conditions, so the drought has ended, a system we were theoretically arguing could persist in a different regime if a catchment had positive feedbacks. And I'll come back to this theoretical work later. Okay, so that's the underlying theory. The science paper was really trying to empirically examine which of these two worlds is supported by observations. So how we did that was we had the Millennium Drought, which for researcher was an amazing natural experiment. For those living through it, it was a traumatic experience. And it went from, depending on where in the state, from 1997 to finishing in 2010. So I'm just going to flip through and show you a couple of maps of the rainfall deciles from the Bureau of Meteorology. So from 91 to 94, much of the state had above average rainfall. So in the 8th to 9th decile. In the years just before the drought, pretty average across most of the state. So we've got a good period of average climate behavior before the drought. Millennium Drought came along from 2002 to 5. We're in this sort of light pink, we're in the 2nd to 3rd decile. As the drought progressed into the late 2010s, things got seriously bad, with many areas the lowest decile or the lowest on record. But what's fascinating is that then the drought ended. And from 2010 to 2013, we had really quite high rainfall, very much above average through much of Victoria. And then in the years afterwards, it's sort of average to below average through much of the rural areas of Victoria. So with these observations, this period of average rainfall, very low rainfall, high then return to average rainfall, we've got a fantastic natural experiment that's over decades to see do our catchments recover or not. So that's what we did. So I'm going to flick through a couple of examples to show you the three main ways that we saw how catchments respond and recover to drought. So first off, I've got the Warningata River, so in the alpine area of Victoria, and I've just plotted here the annual precipitation on the x-axis and the observed annual runoff or streamflow on the y, where each dot represents a year. And I made a bit of a guess. I've color-coded the points by before the Millennium Drought, during the Millennium Drought, or after the drought, after the drought in red. And then for each of those three periods of time, I've just fitted a line. But the line has the same slope, just a different intercept. So it shifts up and down if it wants to, but has the same slope. And what we found for the Warningata River is that 1,000 millimeters of rainfall will produce the same stream flow before, during, or after the drought. So the catchment hasn't changed its behavior. The drought has lower rainfall, so it may be shifting further to the bottom left of this line, but behaviorally it's the same. Same amount of rainfall, same amount of stream flow. Okay, so that's a catchment that didn't really change. Here's another example. This is very similar to my co-author Margareta Saft's earlier work. And we can see here for the Yea River in central Victoria, that now when we have 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, we get about almost 0.55 units of stream flow before the drought and after the drought. However, during the drought, something changed. The same amount of rainfall produced less stream flow. So for this Yea River, it appears the catchment changed its behavior during the drought, but came back, recovered. One of the more fascinating cases is Cairn River, which is in the very southeast corner of Victoria. Heavily forested, native vegetation, relatively very natural catchment for Victoria. And this time we can see that when the drought came along, the orange line shifted down. So we got less rainfall, also less stream flow for the same amount of rainfall. The drought ended and we appear to be persisting in this low runoff regime. And we can really say the difference here between the two sets of lines is the non-recovery. So that all seems interesting to us. But I've had to make a lot of courageous decisions in doing this. I had to decide when the drought started and when the drought ended. And if we're really going to be thinking about whether a catchment recovers or not, it'd be nice to have a way of doing this more objectively, not arbitrarily deciding when the hydrological drought starts and ends. So to do this, we had to develop a whole new way of doing hidden Markov modelling for Streamflow. In case you've never sort of come across this, I'm going to try to explain it. It's quite an elegant idea. Well, the underlying Markov stuff is an elegant idea. And so what the idea of Markov analysis is that we don't really observe what state or regime nature is in, we just observe the outcomes. So we observe, let's say, the stream flow or species population density. We don't really observe the underlying state of the system. But we can try to infer that state. So we could say, well, maybe the catchment is initially within this normal runoff state and it bounces around its value. And it's got some probability, P minus or Pn, of staying in that state each year. And 1 minus Pn of shifting, let's say, to a very low runoff state. And if it's in that state, it'll bounce around for a while, but it's got a probability of P to VL staying in that state each year. And 1 minus that of shifting, let's say, into a third state, bouncing around and then potentially coming back. And every year there's a probability of being in each of these three states. Obviously, we don't know how many states there are. So that's part of the process. But the idea is that the catchment could potentially move around these states with a different probability of being in each one in any year. Okay, so a little bit of detail if you're interested. So the hidden Markov modelling was initially of annual stream flow. And the key idea is that we're simulating the expected value of the stream flow in that year, Q hat, time t, the state, hidden Markov state I, and it's a function of rainfall, P, and then there's some serial correlation because stream flow has these long sort of correlations over time. Then we have another, and each of these can potentially change with state. Then we have a very important term, beta I, and that's that, if you remember that line shifting up and down in those previous scatter plots. So that's allowing that line to shift up and down based on what state it is, and then an error term. So in this case, we were only letting the y-axis intercept shift and the error change with the Markov state. Looked at a few different distributions. We did that fairly carefully, about gamma and truncated. And then for every single site in Victoria, we looked at 68 different model combinations, so different number of states, different model complexity. We use the formal maximum likelihood optimization, some constraints, and then each one was calibrated 10 to 20 times. It's a long, detailed procedure in the paper so that we could work out so that we could be confident we had the global solution. We selected the best model at each stage using the key information criteria, which really just accounts for the number of parameters in the model. And then looked at the most likely state the catchment was in over time. And all of this was written in R, in the S4 object-oriented languages, which is quite a formal way of coding in R to avoid errors. Okay, so what does it look like? Let's get back to the results. Here's the 3 catchments I showed before. And so they've got Wanangata River on the top. So when I applied this hidden Markov results, this is what we get. So I've got observed stream flow on the y-axis, which you'll note is in a log scale. Oh, sorry, observed stream flow in the gray line, I meant to say, sorry. And it's in log scale. And then we've got the simulated or estimated stream flow in green, where the circle represents the median.
The colors are more different.
So what's that, Jim?
You want to mute yourself, Jim? Bit of background noise coming through. Thank you.
Sorry, I thought you were asking a question, Jim. So the circle's the mean stream flow, and the bar is the range that can be expected at that time point. So for this case, we can see that the Millennium Drought came along in the grey, and the catchment didn't change state. There was only one state identified for the Wanangata River, just like the scatter plots. Yea River shows a bit of a different story. It shows that the catchment shifted to a low runoff state a little bit later than I'd assumed in 2001, and then recovered, not when the drought ended, but 1 year afterwards, in water year 2010. And in the years afterwards, it's continued to be in a normal runoff behaviour. Can River shows a different story. It says that it shifted in 1999 and then has continued for the whole record to be within this low runoff state. And we also are able, using this method, to get an estimate of what the stream flow would have been if the catchment had not recovered. Oh, sorry, if the catchment had not changed state. And at the end here, that little grey arrows shows you the stream flow. It's effectively missing. It's gone somewhere else. We're looking at almost 50 mils, which is pretty close to 50% of the total stream flow. So we're talking substantial amount of water. Substantially less water is in the stream than we expected. Okay, so that's nice. Just for 3 catchments, what's going on across the whole state? We went through a torturous process with Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning. Oh, they were very good. It was just a lot of data. So with the Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning, I'm just checking that I'm using the right camera. So with state government, we identified every gauge in the state that had good observations before, during, and after the Millennium Drought, and was unregulated, so no dams or substantial offtake. Then we went and spoke to as many catchment management authorities across the state that were able to engage with us and checked those catchments again. And we got it down to these 161 generally headland upwater catchments. So they really have very small number of water storages as a percentage of total flow and no meaningful offtake. So as part of this Markov analysis, we first off had to define what was normal. And so we said 1990, the stream flow in 1990 was our average year or normal year. So I'm going to tick through the years and we'll see what happens. Okay, 95, a couple shifted into this low runoff state, a couple into high runoff state. Probably just noise, really. Nothing that much going on. Okay, very early on the Millennium Drought, we already see a good fraction of catchments in the east and west shifting into a low runoff state, and even these two in the middle and one in the south shifting to a very low runoff state, so a third state. A few more come into this low runoff state. We've now got much of sort of central Victoria. Last year of the drought, and we can see a good spread of catchments in this low runoff state, with the only exceptions really being this alpine area, some bits along the southwest, and sort of around Wilson's Prom. Okay, so the drought ends. We see a good number of them recover, and I'll just toggle back so you can see that. So before the drought, after the drought, so we're losing lots of these catchments here recovered. Okay, last year of the analysis, this is water year starting in March 2016 to February 2017. And we can see there's this sort of scattering of catchments that had not recovered, really through central Victoria. And some of them are even were remaining in a very low runoff state. And a couple out in these, very remote areas that are still behaving in a low runoff state. Okay, but interesting, concerning if you're a water manager. The obvious question is, well, will the catchments recover soon? Maybe this is just takes a bit of time. So in this plot, we've got the number of catchments that are in a low runoff state over time, where the solid red is from annual analysis and the dashed red is from the seasonal analysis. And just like the map showed, that we can see that the number of catchments in this low runoff state increased rapidly and then slowly ticked up to almost 100 of 161 catchments. Drought ended, good fraction of them recovered. But then in the years afterwards, we can see the relatively stable number of catchments that are remaining in this low runoff state from both the seasonal and annual analysis. And we would argue that if the catchments were just sort of slow to fill up and recover, then this red line would be more like a decay down. But it's, at least on this analysis, it appears to be somewhat, appears to be sort of persisting. So it looks like the catchments aren't going to recover soon by this analysis. But let's dig into this a bit more. Maybe it's just a matter of time. It's a little bit more complex, but I think it's worth trying to illustrate. So what I've got here is the probability of being in each state over time. So we've got the Can River at the top. And so we're looking at the probability in green of being in the normal runoff state. Drought comes along and we have a low probability of being in normal state, and reciprocal of that for low runoff state. What we can, now I've got another site at Bem River, and I just want to highlight the difference. So Can River is showing that the last 3 years of analysis, this, sorry everyone, it's on some weird timer. The last 3 years of analysis, this orange line has no slope or flat slope. So it's not giving us any clue that the catchment is sort of slowly coming back to its normal state, or having a higher and higher probability of being in a normal state. It's sort of appearing stuck. Conversely, at Bem River, we can see this catchment did recover, and just before the recovery, these probabilities were, the probability of being in the low runoff state was declining over time. So it's almost like we were getting an early warning that the catchment was about to recover, and then it actually did. This stuff's, it's complex. So we have to always, it's hard to be absolute about this, but this is where the evidence is going. So that's the two catchments. What about when we look at all of 161? Well, it's broken down into catchments that recovered and had not recovered. And so for the recovered catchments, looking at these blue lines, we can see that most catchments showed an early warning. So most catchments that did recover showed us an early warning. So about 80% or 70% gave us a clue that they were about to recover before they actually did. Sorry. While the catchments that had not recovered in red, we're seeing that only a small fraction of them, really probably less than 20% of them, show any clue that they're about to recover. The majority of the catchments that have not recovered appear to be persisting in this low runoff state. So from this, we argued that it's not just a matter of time. The catchments appear to be stuck, at least for now, in this low runoff state. Okay. What are we talking about here? How much does this really matter? Is this just a bit of a, fun little mathematical exercise? Or are we talking about a real problem for our world? Trying to quantify how much water is missing was difficult because we just don't have the counterfactual. What we tried to do is estimate in a probabilistic sense how much lower is the stream flow compared to the expected normal stream flow. So if the catchment had recovered. And so what we're finding in these central areas of Victoria, for example, looking at this dark red, we're looking at the actual stream flow after the drought was between 0 and 20% of what the normal stream flow would have been. As we move west, we're getting more in the 20 to 60%. So still, we're talking large reductions in the stream flow. I'd like to be able to tell you what this means for aquatic ecosystems, but that's something I don't have the answers for yet. I'm working with Nick Bond at the moment and a student to try to flesh this out across Victoria, but I would be surprised if our aquatic ecosystems didn't show a similar change. It didn't show a non-recovery in the sort of species diversity or distribution. I'd also like to be able to tell you what's happening in Canberra, but that too, or larger parts of the country, but that's work in progress. So we've got a student who's soon going to start at ANU, Stephen Lade, that's trying to look into what's happening around Canberra for the Water Authority there, and hopefully things will happen in the future. Okay, so where is this water going? Someone's got their mic on. Do you mind if someone can mute it? It's just a bit distracting. So
Joseph, looks like you got your microphone on. If you could just turn it off, please.
Thanks, Peter. So we've got this less rainfall is making it to the stream than we would have thought. Where's this rainfall going? There's only so many places it can go, really. Could go to groundwater recharge. Could go up into evaporation or transpiration from the vegetation. I'm skeptical that it's just being stored in the soil, because storing so much water year after year after year would eventually produce stream flow or recharge. So let's start to look at each of these components. We looked at a whole bunch of groundwater bores in the catchments that had and had not recovered. And in the catchments that had not recovered, we see a pretty typical trend like this, where the depth of the groundwater was initially, in this case, was about 8-ish meters. Drought came along, it declined. And what's critical here is that when the drought ended in 2010, the groundwater level has continued to decline in this case, and then it's just been flat. Similarly, at this other bore, groundwater level declined. Drought ended, we had a little bit of recharge, extra water in the groundwater, but it's continued to decline. So we argue that if this missing rainfall is, or missing stream flow is probably a better way to express it. If this missing stream flow was going to the groundwater, we'd be getting more recharge than normal, and we'd be seeing the groundwater come back and recover, but that's not the case. So it looks like groundwater is similarly affected and not a cause. Okay, well, maybe it's got something to do with vegetation evaporation. Nice work done a couple of years ago by a Japanese team, looking at, or using remote sensing to look at rainfall and leaf area index trends. And so rainfall was, not surprisingly, declined over large areas of the state. Leaf area index shows quite a sort of a mixed story. Some areas it's increasing, and some areas it's decreasing. When we look at which is statistically significant, only this area showed a statistically significant decline, which makes me a little bit cautious about this work because there was a rainfall decline. But the leaf area index shows no statistical trend. So the vegetation appears to be the same, behaving or had a similar canopy, even though there was less rainfall. And this works, there's similar work by Anna Eucla that shows a very similar story. Okay, so vegetation seemed to be just as green, just as much leaves during the drought as before the drought. Maybe this is going to increase actual evapotranspiration. So to try to tackle this, we went back to a beautiful paper by Peterson in hydrological processes, where he tries to understand this a little bit across continental North America. And he develops this thing he calls Horton's index. And really it's just the long-term average actual evapotranspiration, how much water actually went up, divided by how much water soaked into the ground. And he does that just by saying it's nothing more simple as the average rainfall, or average annual rainfall, minus the stream flow, so assuming the storage and the catchment doesn't change, that's how much water went up, divided by the rainfall minus the rainfall that quickly ran off into the stream, and he calls it storm runoff. And there's just a base flow filter for estimating that. So this is really just how much went up divided by how much soaked in. And I'm surprised this hasn't been used much in Australia, this technique. I think it's a very nice paper. But when we look at across Victoria at each of the study catchments, we can see that the Horton's index during the Millennium Drought was very high. So for vast areas of Western Victoria, we're looking at 0.95 to 1. So almost all of the rain that infiltrated was transpired. Only in the alpine area does it decline a little bit, but we're still talking in the sense of 80% of the rainfall was that infiltrated was transpired. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's compare this to before the drought, see if things changed. So on the left, I've got the average Horton's index before the drought. Oh, sorry, average Horton's index during the drought minus the Horton's index before the drought. So a positive value would show increased ET. And what we can see is that over majority of the, almost all of the, I think it's almost all, but all but one catchment, the Horton's index increased during the drought. So the plants were able to, a greater fraction of the water that infiltrated was transpired. Particularly high in these alpine areas. When we look at post-drought, so post-drought minus before drought, we can see a little bit more of a mixed story. Over much of the area of the West that hadn't recovered, we can see an increase in the Horton's index by only 0.05 at maximum, and then a bit of a scattering in the south and east. What does this mean though? Well, we could summarize it as that during the drought, actual ET increased across the state as a percentage of infiltration. So it seems like the plants were able to hold on to the water better without letting it go to streamflow. After the drought, actual ET remained elevated across the state, and particularly in the catchments that had not recovered. So there's quite a strong statistical relationship between this higher Horton's index and the catchments that had not recovered. I must mention that also that this is the position of findings of the paper. Like all work, there's different views, and my co-author Margarita Saft isn't convinced by this, and we've got another paper in review in Hess at the moment that was a result of a workshop that we ran with people from across all Australian universities, where we were trying to pull together all the different hypotheses that could explain this shift during the drought and the non-recovery. And the two that pretty much emerged is the one I'm showing you here about plants using water differently. But then the alternative one that Margarita feels like is that the water table dropping, producing a thicker unsaturated zone is also plausible. Okay, that's the empirical stuff done. Let's have a look at what this means theoretically. How do we get to this point, and how does it fit in with theoretical work? So I would argue, well, I've argued for a long time, is that there's two different views about how our catchments behave. So imagine we've got a few years of average rainfall, and our hydrological variable, let's call it streamflow, is initially high. Drought comes along, and unsurprisingly, the streamflow declines. Now, I would argue that, well, then drought ends and we return to average rainfall conditions. Now, all of our hydrological models that we use to simulate current and future streamflow have an implicit assumption that when the disturbance ends, eventually the streamflow will always come back to where it was. It's just a matter of time. So we've really assumed that these catchments are infinitely resilient. And I mean resilience in the sense of Buzz Holling's original ecosystem resilience ideas from '78. Now, I would argue that the observations here show something different, that the disturbance ended and we came back into a different stable state. And hence, I would argue that our catchments some catchments appear to have a finite resilience, where if there is enough of a disturbance, they'll start to behave differently. And we see this in the empirical observations, where, for example, the Yea River, it shifted, drought ended, but it came back eventually. While for the Can River, we saw the case of finite resilience, where it appears to have persisted in this low runoff state. Okay, all of that sort of the theoretical little diagram arose from a whole bunch of theoretical numerical modeling I did some years ago. And I'm not going to go into details here, but just trying to illustrate that we're just trying to simulate the movement of water through a catchment. So we had this aquifer basement, we simulated water moving through the water table laterally, and then also water moving vertically through the unsaturated zone with some vegetation that responded. And one of the key things in this is that it was a saline water table. We used this salinity example because at the time it was the only positive feedback that we could identify within the hydrological literature. And so positive feedback, if you haven't come across these, is like an amplifying process. And to illustrate the one we used in that theoretical work, we'd say, imagine there's a large rainfall event, causes soil moisture to increase. Increased soil moisture gives us groundwater recharge or extra groundwater recharge, which causes the saline water table to go up. Root fraction within the water table increases. Plants don't like salty, wet feet, so the leaf area declines. Transpiration declines because less leaf area, which less transpiration, increased soil moisture. And around we go in this amplifying process of the disturbance. And using this theoretical model, we're able to tick off a few sort of core ideas. We're able to say, well, these multiple coexistent hydrological states do exist when we look at just average seasonal forcing. We're able to work out how this state changes occur, and I'll touch on that next. And then saying, well, rainfall doesn't occur at a seasonal average pattern. It's a daily stochastic process. And so we're able to say, yes, even under stochastic daily rainfall, we still get these multiple states. And critically, daily rainfall can push us between these states. It doesn't really matter if they exist if we never move between them. Okay. Using this theoretical work and empirical stuff, I'm trying to bring it back down to what we can learn from all this. I would say that many of us that there's a widely accepted view in hydrology and surrounding fields that catchments are just like big interconnected buckets with long memory. And so imagine this is, the ball is the current state of our catchment, and it can be moved around up and down with, but it always wants to come back to the stable point at the bottom. Drought comes along and the stable point moves, and the catchment slowly shifts to this new steady location of the single steady state. The drought ends and it's up high on this wall, and it slowly comes back to its steady state. So if we looked at this in what's called bifurcation analysis or continuation analysis, we said, okay, we've got the annual precipitation on the X and stream flow on the Y. This black line would be the steady state value. So if we knew the annual precip, we would know what the long-term annual stream flow would be. We can think about this now saying, well, maybe that, let's pretend the annual precipitation is up here. Drought comes along. So we shift to the left and the stream flow declines. Drought ends, go back to our average rainfall, and now we're at this point. And it's really just a matter of time until the catchment recovers. So that's the catchments are just buckets connected together. I don't think that explains observations. I think there is evidence now that there are positive feedbacks at the catchment scale. I think we could argue that there's two steady states. Drought may come along, and what happens here? It's a bit odd, a bit different to Martin Scheffer and others' ecosystem resilience work. I think it's frankly not correct. What happens is when we have a state change, we actually lose the current state, and we slowly shift to the only remaining state. Drought ends, and we're stuck in this second state. Well, what does that look like when we look at continuation analysis? Saying, well, this time we might be up here. Drought comes along, we fall off this edge and drop down. Drought ends, we return back to our average rainfall conditions, but we're stuck. we're only going to recover if we have a wet period that pushes us afterwards. Returning back to empirical results, I'd say that the wet last 12 months across southeastern Australia, I would argue that is what's required. Maybe it's not enough rain, but it's the type of thing that's required to cause the catchments to recover. So recovery requires a disturbance in the opposite direction. Second last slide, I want to talk about what this might mean. Some implications of catchments having positive feedbacks. So imagine we've got some catchment and we have some land cover change. We might not see any change in the stream flow, maybe ecosystem behavior, but it affects disturbance and recovery, where now it would be much harder to pass this threshold here and recover back. So may make recovery less likely, even though it produces no immediate change in the catchment behavior. A more global problem, climate change. Imagine now we might have this average rainfall behavior. Average rainfall shifts to the left of this threshold. And now climate change is making regime change much more likely. So we're much more likely to cross this point and we're much harder to come back to this point. So a real amplification of the impacts of climate change on streams. Okay, I hope you've found this interesting. I want to just try to wrap up with a few key ideas. So I think we've been able to show that there's complex spatial patterns of drought response and recovery across Victoria. You can't just say, well, this catchment recovered, so the one next to it did. I think the world's more complex than that. I think there's empirical evidence that catchments have a finite resilience to meteorological droughts. I think hydrological droughts can persist long after the meteorological droughts. And theory suggests that wet years are required for this recovery. And I've got a student in his first year looking into this now. I'd say the missing stream flow is likely going to increase AET. Don't know the mechanisms yet. I wish I could give you an answer, but there's two competing hypotheses, ET1 and also the thicker unsaturated zone. And to be a little bit provocative, I'm just going to quote Flavia Tora in Science, where she says, the paper challenges the comforting assumption that water systems naturally tend to absorb disturbances. This emphasizes the necessity to change the way global water processes are conceptualized, which I wish I knew how to do, but that's for another day. Look, this work had a long genesis, but getting to that empirical work that I showed today was only possible because of the Victorian government's water and climate initiative, which they funded, and extremely grateful for them for that. And there's a couple of GitHub products already available if you want to have a play with this stuff yourself. Look, thank you for that, Peter. I hope I went a bit close to time, but I'm happy to stick around for questions.
That was awesome. Thanks very much, Tim.
Pleasure.
Right. Ross has his hand up. Away you go, Ross.
Thanks for the talk, Tim. Really appreciate it. It's I mean, there was a reflectance analysis done across the whole state of Victoria after the Millennium Drought, and it suggested that the number of largely unlicensed headwater farm dams had more than doubled, essentially creating this very large number of retentive structures with very high evaporative losses.
Yep.
Now, my observation of the sites that you showed not recovering would be that those were ones where there was potentially much greater opportunity to install those dams, because the ones that have recovered were already developed much further beforehand. Have you been able to do that analysis of looking at change in on-farm storage and how that may affect your outcomes?
I wish I could give you a full, complete answer. We tried to tackle this in the paper. So we cited some work saying that farm dam volume that farm dams can hold as a percentage of the total flow is very modest I'm talking across the state. There's also we were unable to get any detailed information for these individual catchments. So we really wanted to have information about the dam storage before, during, and after the drought. We weren't able to get deeply into that as we hoped, but what gives me a bit of comfort is that the volumes of water that appear to be missing in this from the stream is quite substantial, and it just doesn't fit with me that when we're talking 25 up to 50% of the natural, well, not, the normal stream flow not appearing. I'm just skeptical that much water could be held in those farm dams. The Hess paper that I mentioned before from the workshop we ran trying to examine hypotheses did look into the farm dams a bit, and that the workshop there agreed similarly that there just wasn't enough evidence to explain the volumes of water missing.
I wouldn't have said that it was a consequence of storage in farm dams. I would have said it was a consequence of evaporative loss from farm dams. Can be very high, and certainly when we've done calculations for headwater streams in this sort of area, you can certainly explain losses on the order of 10 to 25% from headwater streams. And if you propagate that across the landscape, I would consider that it's quite likely that it's a contributing process.
Yep. Okay. I'd be really keen to hear more about what you've been doing. I hope I didn't come across as pretending to have all of the answers on trying to find lines of evidence. And look, I agree that it's not just storage. But I suppose we thought about it as that given the area of the dams and the few millimeters per day of potential ET, it just didn't match with the amount of water missing. It's also, importantly, there's quite a few very remote catchments out on the east where they're just forested in native forests, and they're showing a similar response as well. And a couple down the Strzeleckies that show a similar behaviour.
All right, Carl, what's chuck your question out there?
From a management perspective, is there anything that any managers or governments could do to hasten recovery?
Yeah, I know.
I don't expect you to have an answer.
That's all right. I can tell you the discussions we've had with DELP. So Department of Environment, Land, Water Planning are funding the student I mentioned before. And where we'd like to get to is not so much trying to hasten the recovery, but a great endpoint would be knowing which catchments are close to shifting, either shifting into an undesirable state or close to shifting back, as a way of the state government being able to prioritise resources. If a catchment is never going to change, it probably requires a different management strategy than one that is very close to changing and not recovering. So it's about that prioritization and of effort rather than active things we can do to push them. Maybe one day it'd be nice if we got to the point of being able to understand the impacts of land cover change on recovery, but quantifying the impacts of land cover change on stream flow is even without this regime change is complicated.
All right, Dwayne, you're up.
Yeah, good day, Tim. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the influence of a baseline shift in temperature during that period.
No. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I agree. So I'm just going to flick back to a slide. Give me a sec. And this is, let's want to go back to that map. Can you still see my slides? I think you can, can't you? Yep. A couple more. Okay, so this is the end of the drought. Oh, sorry, the end of the analysis. I'd be surprised if climate change wasn't a part of this already. But I think what is interesting to me is the real spatially heterogeneous nature of the switches. So, catchments next to each other in central Victoria that did and did not shift. So there may be this overlaying sort of climatological trend, temperature, something else. But I think that is heavily influenced by local catchment processes, how the catchment moves water, or partitions and moves water through it. I would expect also that as temperatures continue to increase, we get to that situation where it becomes harder and harder to recover. But that's where our thinking is at the moment.
All right, so mine's just a fairly short question. So is anyone else looking at this stuff elsewhere in Australia much?
Professor Chu at SARO tried to look at recovery. They got a paper in Journal of Hydrology from a handful of years ago. That's the only other work I'm aware of, and they were very much, it was whole built on the assumption that catchments always recover, and they were focusing on the timing of how long it takes to recover.
Yep.
And they just looked at a few catchments in the southeast. I can't remember exactly where, and it was in the order of years to recovery. But that's the only other work I'm aware of. That said, this shift during the drought, this process of catchments shifting during the drought has now been shown more broadly. So Margarita Saft looked at during the drought using the sort of the scatter plot regression method I showed earlier. And she showed this happening across large areas of Australia. And then others have picked up that work and looked elsewhere. So the same shift during drought has been observed in California, Chile, and part of China. I can't remember exactly where. So sort of the first ingredient for the non-recovery, this shift during the drought, has been observed elsewhere. But that non-recovery part and the persistence after drought has not been observed elsewhere. Or hasn't been studied elsewhere that I'm aware of.
Right. Okay. All right, Ben.
Thank you, Tim. Really interesting talk there.
Thanks, Ben.
So a couple, sort of a local observation, because the Cann River is an interesting one. And in terms of there's very forested, but it's also subject to a lot of forestry and replacement of sort of mixed eucalypt forest with silvertop ash, which is, when it regrows, uses a lot of water. So whether you've considered sort of, particularly the forested catchments, the logging history and stuff like that, so if there's, I actually don't know whether it's a case where there had been an increase in logging over that catchment recently, then you'd have and potentially going back decades, an increase in water use in the regrowing forest compared to other areas where the forest is perhaps more maturing. And some of those alpine areas where in the past there was a long history of logging, which had sort of stopped pretty much from, let's say, the early 1990s, and in those forests more maturing are now coming into a sort of using less water per area. But also, more like a second question, if you like, if it is that the vegetation is getting better at extracting water, wouldn't you see an increased leaf area index, particularly once the rainfall returns?
Okay, so first one. So Cann River, the areas we looked at Cann River, I think it is.
It's the Cann River. No, Cann River. I would have thought the Cann River is the one That yellow, okay, yeah, that one, yeah.
That one, yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought in that area it was fairly the plantation stuff was further down or further south. That said, I just want to talk more broadly about state. That's okay, about like land cover change and things. So that was one of the criticisms in one of the reviews that, well, so they had a few criticisms. One of them was maybe it's just that streamflow gauge changed during and after the drought, whether it's changes in the sedimentary the stream bed. And the other one was about land cover change. So firstly, the easy one was stream gauge. We found that around 95% of the catchments had a rock or concrete weir and many rating stage updates, so it didn't seem to relate to the results. The land cover change, so we used a new product from DELP of remotely sensed land cover change at 5-year increments from 85 to 2019, and looked at the change in each land cover category within each catchment, and then tried to relate that to both the change in stream flow and the catchment state. And there were catchments that had changes in native vegetation to plantation, also some small changes in increased urbanization.
So if I just come in there, it's not just changing from native vegetation to plantation. It's if you log native vegetation.
Oh, I don't disagree with you.
Then regrow it with the same vegetation, you'll get a lot more use of water.
Kazira curves. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. I was just going to say that we found no relationship with land cover change over those decades with the stream flow and state. But that was as fine a resolution we were able to go into, in the sense of we weren't able to get more detailed long-term records about changes in, like you said, that regrowth, and it could potentially change the water use. And look, there is 2 little examples. I think it's, I'll just flick back a year. I think it's these 2 catchments here in Wandingalong, where one of them has plantations and the other does not. And there is a clear difference there. I think that is, well, I think it is plausible about the regrowth. But what I would say is that this seems to be such a statewide process that something else seems to be going on. There will be individual catchments, I would argue, that yes, have individual characteristics that may explain the non-recovery. But I think there's a broader story going on across the catchment, across the state, than regrowth or farm dams in individual catchments.
All right, Carl, you're up.
Sorry, another management question.
Sure.
So sorry about that.
Great, all questions.
Was it right to assume that this is primarily happening in smaller creeks, higher up creeks?
We didn't find any relationship with catchment area.
And then follow up, is there any way of predicting where this might happen?
Yeah, so that relates to the student that is working on things now, and where we're trying to go is, it's the last research question. Really. And so let's say if, I'll just toggle through. Let's probably highlight, it's probably best to illustrate the idea. Next one, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so if we could know where this turning point or threshold is in here, then we could potentially forecast the probability of recovery. So if we had a forecast of the next 12 months rainfall or seasonal rainfall, then we could start to say, well, what's the probability that this green point is going to cross this threshold over the next 3 months? That's, I think, the best we'll be able to get to.
All right. Well, I think we better cut Tim some slack and let him go.
That's all right.
He's,
I am very happy to stick around and chat if anyone wants to. It's nice that you reached out, Pete.
Yeah, it's been great to get this a bit broader exposure, and you know, again, as I said, I think it's a really critical issue that I'm a bit all about gloom and doom, and this seems a bit doomy to me. Just kind of makes, you know, everything more difficult in terms of, you know, recovering aquatic species like fish and stuff after these droughts when they get taken out. And, you know,
I think there's much more to this story.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is sometimes we think, oh, you know, we can just bring these fish into captivity, breed them, and then put them back in the creek post-drought. But that assumes the creek exists post-drought. In many cases, they don't. So it's a really fundamental problem. And I suspect it's massively worse in New South Wales and Victoria. But it's one people aren't really thinking about all that much. So if folks didn't notice in the chat, Ross stuck some links into a couple of
Thanks,
papers
Ross.
that Tim mentioned. So that was good. Yeah, so I think with that, we'll close the meeting and say thank you very much, Tim. Really appreciate it.
Oh,